Okay. Sorry. Okay. The purpose of this qualitative phenomenological research is to offer perspective on changes that have taken place affecting medical research in ways that stakeholders, the government, and other healthcare professionals can help research succeed in the years to come. My central research question is, how does the lack of funding affect the business of medical research? My sub-question is, does this phenomenon affect the success of recruitment and retention? I want to thank you both for taking time to meet with me today. My name is Maya Renderos, a doctoral student from Walden University. I would like to talk with you about your experiences participating in medical research and how the lack of funding affects subject recruitment and retention. Specifically, as one of the components of my qualitative research, I am assessing effective ways to increase subject recruitment and increase retention. The interview should take less than 30 minutes. I will be taping this session because I don't want to miss any of your comments. Although I will be taking some notes during the session, because we are on tape, please be sure to speak up that we don't miss your comments. All responses will be kept confidential. This means that your interview responses will only be shared with Walden University staff and my colleagues, and we will ensure that any information we include in our report does not identify you as a respondent. Remember, you don't have to talk about anything you don't want to, and you may end the interview at any time. Are there any questions about what I have just explained?
Nope, sounds good.
Very good.
Okay. Are you willing to participate in this interview?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm just going to say on record that we have agreed that it is okay to use this documentation for public use. Okay, starting the interview. According to the White House, in 2013, in the last few years, President Obama and both parties in Congress have worked together to reduce our deficit by more than $2.5 trillion dollars through a combination of spending cuts and increased tax rates. In 2011, Congress passed a law saying that if they could not agree on a plan to reduce our deficit by $4 trillion dollars, including the $2.5 trillion dollars in deficit reduction lawmakers in both parties have already accomplished over the last few years, about $1 trillion dollars in automatic, arbitrary, and across the board budget cuts would start to take effect in 2013. Sequester has put our military, education, energy, and medical research in jeopardy. My first question for you is, what does it mean to be a medical researcher?
All right. Well, thank you, Maya. And you know what? There's an echo. If you can turn your volume down, or if you have headphones, it will sound better on the recording.
Okay.
I think that's
Um,
better. Did you
is
hear
that
the
better?
echo? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's better now. There's no echo.
Okay.
Okay. So as far as what does it mean to be a researcher?
Yes.
There's two different kinds, right? What we do is private research. So these are clinical trials funded by pharmaceutical companies, right? So they have an idea of some new treatment or a new
Okay.
device, molecule, whatever it might be, that they want to put out, they want to market, they want to eventually sell. And because of the regulatory system, we need the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to approve the drug to make sure it's safe and it has efficacy. So that's the world of private research in a nutshell. The world of academic research, while they follow the same process, is a little different, especially when it comes to funding. Okay, so you have the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, that usually fund these trials. These are federally funded trials. Oftentimes, they'll work in collaboration with universities, public universities usually, or doctors, private independent doctors who may be affiliated with the university. So the funding for those trials come from NIH or other nonprofit, usually government entities. They're still audited by the FDA. They're still regulated by the FDA. Sometimes big pharma is involved, sometimes not. But the main difference is where the funding comes from. And that also uh, leads to what they're looking for. Because oftentimes there's enough private funding from the private research to have treatments and drugs or devices for the lifestyle type of drugs like Viagra or hypertension stuff that's already out, or hypercholesterol drugs, where there's like 10 of these kind of drugs already in the publicly funded research. They usually focus on rare disease, orphan drugs, and private research focuses on those as well because they get different incentives, usually faster timeline, faster regulatory approvals if they focus on those. So that's the main difference between public and private, and then basically that's what research entails. And just for the record, I don't consider myself a researcher. I consider myself a business person that runs a research company. And Chris probably feels the same way, although I'll let him talk.
All right, thank you, Dan. Um, I would agree with Dan and everything he had said. Uh, I'm sorry, I don't have anything to elaborate. There's something I do have to say, but I'll bring it up later, possibly.
Okay. I agree with you about not being a medical researcher, but being a businessman,
Hmm.
businesswoman. I don't think people outside of healthcare understand that. It's a business. Okay, so the next question is, what is the most difficult part about being a medical businessman?
Uh, just as difficult as selling something at 7-Eleven would be. I mean, it's about making profit. And although this industry, we have a lot more regulatory agencies involved. You have the FDA, you have IRB. IRBs are in charge of patient safety. You have the community, you have the patients themselves, you have the family members of the patients. Then you have the drug companies themselves. So they do regular audits, the CROs, which are the contract research organizations, which actually, I have a company that's a CRO in and of itself. So there's a lot of moving parts in research, and I think that's the most difficult part of the business, because unlike running a 7-Eleven, where you have a very simple understanding of what it takes to generate a profit, you've got to sell things, right? In research, there's a lot more moving parts. It's a little more complex, because of all the players and the stakeholders that are involved.
Okay. Um, let's see. I'm so sorry. Okay. What is your role in your profession as a businessman?
So I like to think of myself as a walking CRO. So when it comes to helping drug companies, research clinics, patients, drug companies need to find research clinics to do their trials. Research clinics need to find drug studies to conduct. Study participants need to find studies to enroll in. So I look at myself as the CRO that will bring these parties together, and hopefully in the process make a nice profit so I can buy the Clippers one day.
Right. Okay. How do you feel about the sequester budget cut that took effect March 1st, 2013? Would you say that sequester helped or harmed the economy?
You want to handle this one?
Actually, I was laughing. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yes. How do you feel about the sequester budget cut that took effect March 1st in 2013? And would you say that sequester helped or harmed the economy? And as it relates to medical research?
Okay. I really think it had no bearing on medical research. Again, at least from the research that we conduct, as ours is funded by private institutions, it's had no bearing. Sequester cuts may harm academic research. That I don't know. I don't know how the cuts were laid out and if they had any bearing on academic research. Maybe you could enlighten us on that.
Well, that's one of the problems with relying on government for your funding is budget cuts are all too common. So if anything, this will help private research, I think, gain more market share because early on in clinical trials, it was 80-20. 80% of the market share went to academic institutions. And early on, I mean the 40s, 50s, 60s. And around the 80s and 90s, and definitely now, that has shifted. It's like 80-20 private research now. So the budget cuts are probably just going to give more market share to the private companies, which is very good for myself and Chris.
Okay. I, I don't have my data on me right now because
I'm pretty
this
sure
is
it's
to
80-20.
focus on you. But yeah, back to what Chris was saying, it's affected academic research for sure.
Yeah.
Um, in my opinion, I feel like that the president should not have touched funding when it came to research at all. I
Yeah.
mean, so many people were laid off, and but that's part of what my qualitative study will be about. So
Yeah, and who
I
it hurts
started
the
off
most is
giving some
the
information about the background of, sorry, my dog's demanding attention. Um, I went into some background about what is the NIH, how it relates to research, how the sequester tied into that, and then I'm going to focus on how it affects recruitment and retention.
yeah.
So,
Who it affects the most is simple. It's the orphan drugs, the rare diseases, the the groups that drug companies look at and say there's not enough money to be made
Hmm.
here. That's who it's gonna affect.
right. Okay. What are the consequences for the next generation of researchers in years to come if budget does not increase?
If budget does not, it's gonna be 100% private research and 0% public. Although I don't think that's gonna happen.
It'll all be for profit, and groups Dan mentioned earlier won't receive any help.
Yeah.
Right. I ideally uh, wish, and I was having this conversation with a friend saying if we in the medical community could just come together as a community and find other ways, to increase the funding without having to pull from the government, it would help a lot.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and for the
uh,
economy as a whole, for that matter, not just research.
right. I mean, our entity alone makes up a good portion of jobs. I don't have the statistics yet. I'm still working on that. I'll get that. But people don't understand how big the medical industry is and how it affects America alone. And then it affects, companies outside of America, and that's when you get into outsourcing and things of that nature. But
I heard the number just
um,
the other day. They said medicine makes up about a fifth of the economy of America,
that,
approximately. I don't know if that's accurate or not. That's what I heard.
Yeah, it's probably true.
I can believe it. Um, okay, let's see. What are some examples of what takes place when a research site is forced to shut down?
Hmm. It's ugly. In the public sector, I don't know how it works. They probably have more time to prepare. I'm sure the employees will receive their paychecks. Um, the study participants, though, um, I mean, they won't have a place to go. Let's take rare disease for as an example. Some I know a lot of study participants that live in a remote location of the United States and travel to big cities to join a study for at one of these academic institutions because there's no other place around them or near them. Sometimes they travel halfway across the country, and you see this a lot in oncology trials where they'll travel from like New York to California or to Houston at the big oncology research institutes, usually public institutes, to join studies. So if one of these organizations shuts down, were to shut down or just cut one of their units for research. It will affect tons of people. You're going to have some people that will not have clinical trials as an option. And clinical trials are never meant to be treatments, but for some people it is their last chance, their last hope. And for those people, I mean, it's terrible.
Right. That's a misconception too. When you're saying, people think that it's meant to treat, and I hate when I hear someone say, well, back, in slavery days or the Tuskegee days, it's, people need to be more educated. I mean, without research, we would not have gotten as far as we have, to saving lives in so many diseases. So, okay. And my last question, how does this, oh, well, I guess you kind of tapped on that. How does this affect recruitment and how does it affect retention,
Yeah,
basically?
well, recruitment's very simple, and I don't know how these big institutions do as far as recruitment is concerned. Um,
Yeah.
Funding at these larger institutions, they usually get a grant, so they don't necessarily get paid based on who they recruit. They'll just get a grant.
Mm.
And if they don't spend that much money that year, they won't get as much the next year, just like most government entities. So I don't know how much recruitment is actually involved at these places, other than a website and listing it on clinicaltrials.gov. I know in the private research clinics, there's a lot of recruitment going on, and that's because they're competing with themselves. The research clinics are competing because they have what's called competitive enrollment, where once the study enrolls X amount of people, there's no more enrollment for anyone else and no more payments. That's what that means. So that we don't get grants. And Chris wanted to say something to you.
Well, for academic research, Dana touched on, it's more for diseases that people are definitely seeking treatment, whereas that may not necessarily be the case for private. So there's probably very little need to actually physically recruit, I would assume. If anything, the individuals that would qualify for the studies are actually looking for places that will help them.
Yeah, yeah. It's happened. I know people who pay their own money for their own flight across the country to join a trial
Yeah.
at some of these academic institutions. It's usually, again, in the cancer research.
Okay. So wrap up questions. There are two, and then I have a question
All
for
yours.
you. I'm sorry.
I said we're ready for them.
Oh, okay. What advice do you have for research sites that are forced to close after there has been no more funding? Uh, what would you suggest?
Now you're speaking in the private sector
Public.
or public?
Well, because yeah, your area is more private. We can go with private. All
Uh,
advice is good advice.
Private. If you're a struggling research clinic, you need to email me, Dan at theclinicaltrialsguru.com. We could work something out. I honestly have no advice. I mean, if you're gonna be shutting down and you're the owner, somewhere along the lines, it's your fault ultimately because you have full control over the situation. Either you are not proactive enough, bad luck, whatever the case may be. I know it's happened to me a few times. I've never shut down any clinic, but I came close, and guess what? It would have been my fault. If you're an employee, it's not your fault, but you need to move on. You need to go find another place. I know a lot of study coordinators that want to be monitors. Now might be a good time to do that. I don't know. It's life. Businesses shut down. The one I feel most sorry for the study participants because oftentimes they will have to go a little more out of their way to find a place to do research. But as far as the owners, I mean, hey, this is a business, and the employees, you have to move on. You know that as an employee, you're taking a risk every time you go to work for your employer. It may shut down. You may not have a job the next day.
Foster. You could.